Section 12 of Hearth and Home, Collected Poems and Stories by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Siege of Toulon by John S. C. Abbott. Toulon was the great naval depot of France. It contained a population of 25,000 inhabitants. When the French people adopted a free constitution in place of the unlimited despotism of the Bourbons, the allied monarchs commenced their march upon Paris. The royalists in Toulon rose and surrendered the city to an English fleet, which was then cruising outside the harbor. The constitutionalists sent an army to recapture the city. They commenced a siege and accomplished nothing. 3 months thus passed, while a French army of 40,000 men under incompetent generals were making no progress. While affairs were in this strain, the young Napoleon, as brigadier general, was sent to Toulon in command of the artillery train. He was astonished at the incapacity with which the siege had been conducted. The batteries were planted at such a safe distance that the shot could not reach the foe. The great object of the officers seemed rather to be to shield their own men from harm than to inflict harm upon the enemy. Napoleon sent a vigorous remonstrance to the Convention against such a mode of conducting war, and announced his plan for taking the city. His plan was adopted, and though he was not entrusted with the supreme command, which was assigned to Dugommier, he was permitted to carry out his plan. One day his brother Louis visited him. They walked out to a place where an unavailing and a foolish assault had been made the previous day. 200 bodies of French soldiers were strewn over the ground. All these men, said Napoleon, have been needlessly sacrificed. Had intelligence commanded here, none of these lives need have been lost. Learn from this, my brother, how necessary it is that those should possess knowledge who aspire to command others. Napoleon had devoted all his energies to the work he had undertaken. He shared all the toils and perils of his men. He had soon obtained a train of 200 heavy battering cannon. Every day there was a storm of battle to distract the attention of the enemy while the works were being completed. There were daily and nightly skirmishes and sallies and deadly assaults, and the dreadful tide of successful and unsuccessful war ebbed and flowed. At one time, when the enemy were directing their fire upon his works, he had occasion to send a dispatch from the trenches. A young private stepped from the ranks, and resting the paper upon the breastworks, began to write at Napoleon's dictation. A cannonball at that moment struck the ground, throwing the sand over their persons and the paper. The young man, without a tremor, quietly remarked, "Thank you, we shall need no more sand upon this page." This fearlessness and readiness attracted the attention of Napoleon. He fixed his keen eye upon him and said, "Young man, what can I do for you?" "Everything," was the prompt reply, and placing his hand upon his own shoulder, he added, "You can change this worsted into an epaulette." A few days after, Napoleon sent for the same young man to reconnoiter the trenches of the enemy, and suggested that he should assume the disguise of a peasant. "Never," replied the soldier. "I will go in my uniform, though I should never return." He accomplished his mission and returned unharmed. These incidents revealed character, and the young soldier was immediately promoted. This was Junot, afterward Duke of Abruzes. At length the hour had arrived when all was ready for the grand assault. Every contingency had been provided for. It was midnight of the 11th of December, 1793. A cold storm of wind and rain beat upon the embattled hosts. A fortress of the enemy, called Little Gibraltar, which commanded the town, was the main object of assault. To distract the attention, the hostile lines were everywhere attacked. In a few hours, 8,000 shells were thrown into Little Gibraltar until the massive works were a pile of ruins. The order was given to charge. The struggle was desperate, but the French hewed their way onward over the dying and the dead, and with fixed bayonets and gleaming sabers, leaped over the ramparts and rushed in at the embrasures, and the whole force of the defenders were soon prisoners or silent in death. "General," said Napoleon to the aged Dugommier, as he informed him that the tricolor was floating over the bastions of Little Gibraltar, "go and sleep. We have taken Toulon." Very eloquently has Walter Scott said, "It was on this night of terror, conflagration, tears, and blood that the star of Napoleon first ascended the horizon, and though it gleamed o'er many a scene of horror ere it set, it may be doubted whether its light was ever blended with that of one more dreadful. Though the fortress which commanded the city was thus taken, the conflict continued unabated until morning. The genius of Napoleon was perhaps more conspicuous in the energy with which he followed up a victory, reaping all its benefits, than the skill with which he achieved that victory. In this conflict, as in most others which have raged on earth, both parties seemed honestly to think that they were in the right. The English, who with their fleet had entered and taken possession of Toulon, thought that the French had no right to wrest from the king absolute power, and that the establishment of republican institutions in France endangered the repose of Europe. Therefore they prayed to God for a blessing upon their arms. The French, on the contrary, declared that the despotism of the Bourbons had become absolutely intolerable, that the people were not created merely to be the bondservants of the lords, and that the people of France not only had a right, but that it was their sacred duty to secure free institutions for themselves and their children, and therefore they prayed to God for his blessing. It is not easy for man, with his limited knowledge, to adjust the balance of right and wrong. Here was the most cruel, sanguinary war inaugurated which ever cursed the globe, and yet both parties deemed themselves in the right. There is a day of judgment coming when there will be a just award. The tragedy was not yet ended. When the morning dawned, an awful spectacle was revealed to the eye. The streets of Toulon were red with blood. Thousands of the mangled and the dead were strewn through the dwellings and the streets. In many parts of the city fierce conflagrations were blazing. The cannonade was still continued with unintermitted roar, and the shells were incessantly exploding in the thronged streets. Napoleon allowed himself not a moment to rest, or to exult over his victory, but at every point harassed his discomfited and terrified foe. Guns were immediately brought upon the eminence at Little Gibraltar to throw balls into the English ships. Lord Howe, in command, conscious that the city was no longer tenable, made signals for the fleet to prepare for immediate evacuation. The terror of the royalists was dreadful. They knew full well the doom they were to expect from republican fury in those days of unbridled violence. The English took as many of the French ships of the line as could be got ready for sea. The rest, consisting of 15 ships of the line and 8 frigates, were collected to be burned. A fire ship, filled with every combustible substance, was towed into their midst, and at 10 o'clock of the next night the torch was applied. The night was dark and still. The flames of the burning ships burst forth like a volcano from the center of the harbor, illumining the scene with lurid and almost noonday brilliance. The water was covered with boats, crowded with fugitives, hurrying in despair to the English ships. To increase the horrors of the scene, a furious cannonade was in progress all the time from every French battery. Bombs exploded upon the thronged decks. Many boats were sunk. At last, the rear guard of the English abandoned the ramparts and hurried to their boats. At the same moment, the Republican army, 40,000 strong, came rushing into the city. The English fleet spread its sails and soon disappeared beneath the horizon, bearing nearly 20,000 wretched exiles to homelessness, penury, and lifelong woe. End of section 12, read by Elsie Selwyn.